선과 교를 함께하는 겸수해 나가는 불이선회를 자리매김해서 지금까지 이어오고 있는데요. 우리의 이 작은 몸짓이 나 혼자만의 몸짓이 아니고 수행 공동체를 풍요롭게 가꾸어 나가고 더 나아가서 한국불교와 어떤 세계 불교의 어떤 마중물 역할을 하는 어떤 수행으로서의 불교를 더욱더 발전시키는 그런 계기가 되어줬으면 하는 마음 간절합니다.
네, 정말 먼 길 각처에서 오시느라고 우리 대중 스님들 감사하고 고맙기도 하고 너무 좋습니다. 사실 우리 이 선회는 청정 승가 공동체의 모임인데 이렇게 결제철, 해제철, 산철 관계없이 우리 승가는 공동체로서 자주 모여서 수행을 탁마해가는 것, 그것이 우리 수행 공동체의 가장 빛나고 아름다운 자리가 아닌가 싶습니다.
대중 여러분 안녕하십니까? 나는 해명이라고 하는데 정목신 너무너무 친절하게 대접해 주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 확실히.
일단 버스웰 교수님은 좀 우리나라하고도 인연이 있지만 좀 그 이력이나 이런 게 독특한 분이시잖아요. 특히 우리 한국불교에서는 좀 관심을 가져야 될 학자다. 학자이면서 또 수행하는 분이시지 않습니까? 그분이 이제 UCLA 대학에서 한국불교학자로서 당신이 명예교수로 퇴직을 하셨고 퇴직하고 명예교수로 계시는데 그 뒤를 좀 이어가기를 갈망하시잖아요. 어떤 면에 우리보다 더욱더 간절하게 그렇게 갈망하고 너무나 간절히 발언하시는 그 모습을 보면서 제가 개인적으로 무척 감동을 받았었어요. 근데 그때 이제 버스웰 교수님이 뭐라 그러셨냐면 올 수 있는 인연만 된다면 한국에 와서 이렇게 산사에 좋은 숲속에 있는 절에서 이제 마지막 시간을 보낼 수만 있다면 그렇게 보내고 싶다. 그러니까 한국에 대한 그리움이 가득하시더라고요. 그러니까 단순히 한국에 대한 그리움만 있는 게 아니라 한국 불교와 또 스님들과 같이 지냈었던 승가 공동체 일원으로 지냈었던 것에 대한 추억이 교수님한테는 굉장히 강하게 자리하고 있더라고요. 제가 느낀 게 우리보다 더 간절한 염원을 가지신 교수님이 너무 감사했고 또 우리 선회는 수행하고 싶어서 오는 스님들의 모임이잖아요. 그런 분들에게 버스웰 교수님을 소개하고 싶었고요. 그래서 뵙는 것만으로도 좋고 화면을 통해 다시 보시겠지만 그냥 버스웰 교수님은 이 인상 자체가 그대로 그냥 선승 분위기고 옆에 있기만 해도 편하고 너무 좋아요. 예, 그래서 초대하게 됐습니다.
And that's what I saw today with teachers like 정목스님 and 오람스님, even a younger monk, 명강스님. You know, to see monks like this who are stepping up and really taking their place as leaders in the tradition, and seeing also this large group of young monks and nuns who are ready themselves to step up and take the place as the successors. Well, actually, I feel like a very old man who is looking at the next generation and really the next generation taking over the tradition. Many of the monks who I practiced with were very, eminent teachers in their own rights, and many of them have now died. But this is to say that the generation that I knew of Korean Buddhists, they are passing away. And now it's time for the new generation to step up and continue their tradition.
제가 2022년에 미국에 이제 초청을 받아서 LA, 샌프란시스코, 뉴욕에서 특강을 한 적이 있었습니다. 한류와 한국 불교에 대해서. 그때 이제 교수님께서 오셔서 같이 들어주시고, 한국학의 전 세계에서 가장 유명한 곳이 UCLA인데 거기 한국학 프로그램을 만드시고 한국 불교 연구를 아주 굉장히 열심히 해 오셨는데 버젤 교수님께서 이제 전 재산을 기부를 하셔서 이제 그 후임 교수님을 마련하고 그 다음에 장학금을 주려고 그런 큰 마음을 내셨다 그래서 저도 그 특강을 해서 모인 그 어떤 기금을 저도 같이 이제 기증을 하고 그 다음에 이 교수님의 뜻을 좀 한국인들에게 많이 알리려고 그렇게 했었습니다. 교수님은 이제 구산 큰 스님의 상자이셨고 그래서 송광사의 특히 보조국사의 이 사상을 연구를 하셔서 전 세계에 이제 보조국사의 사상을 보조 사상을 알리신 분이죠. 보조 전서가 있는데 그것을 전부 영역하셨어요. 그래서 전 세계 사람들이 볼 수 있도록 그렇게 만들어 주셨던 분입니다. 그래서 서양의 한국 불교, 한국 선불교를 이제 진짜 학문적으로 제대로 알리는 그 1세대로서 굉장히 중요한 인물이시고 많은 역할을 하셨거든요.
So nowadays it is not an exaggeration to say that there is currently a very strong interest and exorcism for Korea
Yes.
worldwide.
Right.
What is your assessment of the current interest and standing of Korean studies?
Korean studies has changed a lot during the course of my career. When I began at UCLA, for example, I was the first person they had ever hired in Korean studies, even though I was really hired in Chinese, in fact. But they knew that I had a really strong interest in Korea and encouraged me to build up Korean studies. So we did try to ensure that Korean was on equal par with Chinese and Japanese at UCLA. I think Korean studies is changing, like all of East Asian studies is changing. When I started out, there was a very strong emphasis on pre-modern studies, both of Japan and China as well. So people were called sinologists. They studied, ancient texts. Nowadays, there's much more of a shift toward the modern and contemporary periods. And I think you see this in Korea too. I mean, Korea is such a vibrant contemporary culture with, K-pop and K-drama and temple food is sort of popular in the West as well. I remember I was told after I had arrived at UCLA that there had been a lot of resistance to starting Korean among some of the other scholars. One of the scholars I was told said, well, can't they just study Korean at a junior college somewhere? Why do we need to do Korean? Didn't understand at all. But I think that's completely changed. You could not have an Asian language department now and not do Korean. In the same way, you could not do an introduction to Buddhism now and not have something on Korean. So between the 12 students who I produced and others who come into the West to study Buddhism, become professors themselves, I look around now and I see there really is a field of Korean Buddhist studies, whereas when I began there was not. And even the scholars who don't know very much about Korea know they need to do something on Korea. They can't just ignore it anymore. So I feel, privileged to have been someone who was able to make that kind of contribution to ensure that Korea will no longer be neglected in the study of either East Asia or the study of Buddhism. Well, I've had involvement with Korean Buddhism for over 50 years now. And I've never, though, had a chance to actually speak to monks and nuns about Korean Buddhism. And I thought it would be fun to sort of talk to them about my own experiences with Korean Buddhism, why I was involved with Korean Buddhism in the first place, what I learned from that experience, and what I think they should be proud of about their tradition.
우리 로버트 버스웰 교수님 강사로 모시겠습니다.
대중 여러분 안녕하십니까? 나는 해명이라고 하는데 확실히 여러 가지 이름 가지고 있었어요. 그 태국에 있을 적에는 그 로차노 미국이라고 하고 그 중국에 있을 때는 그 노사나 미국이라고 하는데 한국으로 와서 저기는 해명으로 바꿔왔습니다. 근데 저는 처음으로는 19살 때 태국에 가서 그 삼위계 받고 20살 될 때는 그 미국에도 봤는데 그때는 다무윳 종파에서 입산했습니다. 저는 태국에 있을 적에는 해연사에서 오시는 스님 두 분 왔습니다. 그 커이 스님하고 일타 스님 같이 태국으로 순례하러 왔습니다. 근데 그분들 처음으로 한국 불교에 대한 얘기 좀 들었어요. 한국에서는 이렇게 산속에 있는 사찰도 많고 아주 부지런히 공부하는 스님들도 많고 일중생활, 대중생활 같이도 하고. 그러니까 저는 한국에서 1년, 홍콩에서 1년 있다가 어디로 갈까 생각하면서 한번 한국으로 해볼까 생각했습니다. 그냥 바로 갔습니다. 전혀 모르는데 그냥 갔어요. So I was taken down to Songgwangsa to meet Kusan Sunim and asked to stay there. He allowed me to stay, so I began to practice at Susansa. 저는 한국에 도착했을 때는 이미 미국에 봤기 때문에 행자 생활 안 했습니다. 그러니까 바로 수산사에 들어가가지고 그때는 해국 스님 그 입성이었습니다. 또 해국 스님도 계시고 정면 스님도 계시고 무야 스님도 계시고 근데 아주 훌륭하신 수행자들이 많이 계셨습니다. 해국 스님, he was the first 입성 that I knew in Korea, and he was probably I think 입성 maybe 4 or 5 times during the 5 years I was there. And he was a very, very good ibsang. He would keep very close control over the hall, but provided a very safe space for people to practice also. But with him, I noticed often, because he had to be the one who strikes the jukpi to begin and end the periods, there were times when he would pick up the jukpi and say, you could tell he wanted to keep sitting, but he had to strike the jukpi and start walking. So you go, okay, jukpi chigo. But to me, as a very young monk, and as someone who wasn't much older than I was, he was a real inspiration for me, and I became very close to him. Actually, he was probably the one monk who I was closest to in Korea, I think. Okay. But there were 2 other monks that really impressed the Westerners, especially those of us who had been elsewhere before. I had been in Thailand. I had met some meditation teachers in Thailand, and there were a couple of monks who really looked to me like the kind of monks you would find in Thailand, the meditators in Thailand. 한 분은 무여 스님이었습니다. 그분은 한 개체 동안 말씀 한 마디도 안 했습니다. 완전한 무근으로 했어요. 근데 물론 앉을 때는 딱 앉아가지고 움직이지 않고 그냥 바로 화두를 들고 있었는데, but the other one who I think impressed us the most was 척명 스님. 봉암사 오래동안 그 선원장 계셨었는데. 말해본 적이 있었는지 모르겠지만은 그분은 그 눈이 보면은 얼마나 깊은 눈도 있었는지 말도 못합니다. 확실히 그 태국에서 같은 사람들도 봤어요. 그 아주 깊이 산맥에 들어가는 사람들. Well, I had not been anywhere outside the United States before I left for Thailand to ordain as a monk. So that was my first time ever being not only out of the US, but being in a Buddhist country. And I kind of had a vision of what a monastic life would be like. And somehow Thailand did not quite fit that vision, and I don't know why that is. Part of it was that I was in a city monastery to start in Bangkok, which is a very dense urban environment. So it wasn't quite what I really wanted as a monk. I was in the forest for some weeks as well, doing meditation. But forest monasteries in Thailand, you essentially are very isolated. You have your own kuti, your own little cottage in the forest, and you practice by yourself all day long. There's no daejung senghwal, there's no group practice. So when I came to Korea, it was just a revelation because there were all these monks present at Songgwangsa. Songgwangsa was a very vibrant place when I arrived. Kusan had become Pangjang just a couple of years before I arrived, actually. And many of the most dynamic young monks at the time who were doing Kanghwa practice came to Songgwangsa during the Kelche. So I got to be good friends with many of the monks who have become leaders in the order. One thing I really appreciated about Korean Buddhism was the fact that you practiced together, you worked together, you even slept together in the same room, in the big room, the so-called kunbangesa. So all the monks who were in the kitchen or in the office, they were doing all the work that had to be done in the monastery, so that I had the privilege of doing meditation and study at Songgwangsa. So I really appreciated the group practice aspect of Korean Buddhism. But I think as much as that too, I just love the environment. I love mountains. And Korean mountains are just so beautiful, and the monasteries are in such beautiful, pristine mountain fastnesses that I just thoroughly enjoyed the life. So when I was very young, as a teenager, I knew nothing about Buddhism, nothing about Korean Buddhism. I wanted to be an astronomer, a cosmologist, to try to understand how the universe was created and where we came from. But as the mathematics got harder, I realized I was never going to be a cosmologist, so I began to think about the big questions of life instead, including this one question that Jung mentioned about how do you live without exploiting other people? And that became kind of a hwadu for me, I think. And so as I thought about this question, how do you live without exploiting other people, I happened to read as a sophomore in English in high school, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. And I thought, well, maybe living the life of a hermit is the only way to really live without exploiting other people. And eventually, when I was about 16, I came across Buddhism for the first time. Very simple, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, Pachangdo. But I immediately resonated with Buddhism, and I identified as a Buddhist, even though I didn't know very much about it at all. So what I thought was especially interesting in Buddhism was how there were practical exercises you could undertake in order to put into practice the teachings of the religion. It wasn't just good ideas, there was a practice behind it. And so I finally came across a book on Vipassana meditation called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation by Nyanaponika Mahathera. And I read that book and I thought, okay, this is what I really want to do. I want to do, but in Thailand, the monks really didn't do Vipassana. The focus of forest practice, supsake inen amja inende, there it's all done with, they do chitta, brightening, purifying the chitta, the maum. So very much like what happens in Korea, actually. But I continue to have this strong interest in doctrine, in kyori. I had studied Pali when I was in Thailand. I had studied Chinese for several years now. I was beginning to learn some Korean. And so I liked reading text. And somehow reading text really helped to ground me, to kind of settle my practice. But my teachers kept saying, you have to put scholarship aside and just do meditation. And so I always felt that there was this tension between doctrine and practice, doctrine and meditation, san and kyo. And it seems that whenever I would make progress in practice, I would always be pulled back into explaining that practice through scholarship. And I think this was actually good for me because it did help me to understand the connection between thought and practice instead. So when I was at Songgwangsa during the spring and fall 해제, I would go down 무주전에 내려가가지고 I would study texts, read about Korean Buddhism. During the winter and summer 결제 때, I'd go up to Susansa and practice meditation only, back and forth, back and forth. And this is where finally I can return to Jinul, because I began to read Jinul quite intensively during this period. And Kusan Snim saw my interest, and he encouraged me to think about translating all of Jinul's works into English. So I began to work on that. And so it was very good for me, because actually I saw Jinul as somebody who seemed to confront the same issues I had. He had learned about Buddhism, about Sun Buddhyo, really through reading, not through his connections with Sun masters, just as I had learned as well. And he was trying to understand how the mind of the Buddha and the words of the Buddha were intersecting with each other. Yes, I was just going to show a couple of. This is a Jinul stupa that he mentioned, the Gamno top in the back. This is Jinul again, Kusan. Yeah, so when I was at Songgwangsa Isanun, this is a photo of me in my Thai robes. I had just arrived from Thailand. I like the headline, 5 Alien Priests. It sounds like these were monks who came from outer space, you know. This is 구산세는 아주 착한 사람인데 얼마나 강한지 말도 못합니다, actually. And this is Songgwangsa Isanun. Songgwangsa is very hot and humid, so in the summertime we didn't do kahing junjin anymore, just about 10 hours a day, and then we go off in the afternoon for a walk with some of the people there. 지눌스님 is 바로 앞에서, and I'm in the back there with the hat on. And we're back to Jinul then again here, and his synthetic thought here. So I think what's interesting in Jinul is that his conception of practice starts from something that Woram Sinin was speaking about yesterday also, this kongjak yangji, this void and calm, numinous awareness, so-called. And this comes out of Kyubong Chongmil, of course, and also Chengguan, Jingguan Guksa. But this is the factor of sentience, which is common to all sentient beings. So what is numinous awareness? It's just the fact that we are aware of the world around us. And you can trace this idea back, I think, even into early Buddhist materials. This is a quote I have from the Anguttara Nikaya in Pali, which is, papasaram idam bhikkhave chittam. So this mind, O monks, is luminous, bright, luminous. But it's sullied by adventitious defilements, the klesha, upaklesha, that come from outside the mind. So here's the quote here. And this is really the same as, I think, numinous awareness. 또 원지 불교에서는 그런 concept, 개념도 있긴 있는데, it's sort of suppressed in the main canon, I think. So it's been edited out by the scholastic compilers. But I think it resurfaces in early Mahayana materials in India. This is even in something like the Perfection of Wisdom materials, the Panya Paramutta Gyangnesanan. This is a quote here: the essential nature of thought is transparently luminous. So this is Kongsasangende. This strand also appears there as well. But I think where you see this strand of thought most prominently is in Tathagata Garbha, Yorejang Sasang에서. And in Yorejang Sasang, the idea is that the mind is inherently luminous and bright, it's pure, but the ignorance of the mind is simply a mistaken perception that comes from what they say is unsystematic attention, the attention to a false sense of self. If you can remove that, you can restore the natural brightness and clarity of the mind. And so really what Yorejang Sasang is saying is that in order to become enlightened, all you need to do is to stop thinking that you're not enlightened, and your natural enlightenment will manifest itself again. And so this Yorejang Sasang is really one of the strands from which numinous awareness arises. This term is actually, though, a Chinese term. You don't find this in Indian materials, this precise term. The original source is the Nugumgyang, the Shrungama Sutra, an apocryphal text. But you see it especially in the writings of Chongmil, and this is where Jinul gets the idea from. And so what this numinous awareness is, as I said, is sentience. It's the ability to sense the world around us. And what the awareness does, it brightens up the sense spheres, allowing them to be seen, to be heard, to be touched, and so forth. And so even in like Imje, we see this same thing. You are right now vividly illumining, brightening up all the things of this world and taking the measure of this world. So 똑같은 사상입니다. But this natural radiance doesn't just shine over the sense spheres, allowing them to be seen. It can become so bright that, in fact, it shines through objects, and it reveals the emptiness that's inherent in all things. And it's sort of like a searchlight, very bright searchlight. If you put your hand over the searchlight, you can see through your hand. You can see the bones and the veins in your hand. Same with the mind, it's very bright. It sees through things then. And so this brightness of the mind, this numinous awareness is shining out of all of your senses, brightening up the world around you, allowing you to see it. If you can turn that around on itself, you can shine onto your original nature. And this is what Jinul calls tracing back the radiance, 회광 판조, 판조이라고 하는데 여러 가지 단어 사용하긴 하는데 판조 is the most common, I think. Tracing back the radiance, I call this. And so rather than going outwards to the sense spheres, you turn it around on yourself so you see your own original nature. And there's a commentary on the Chodedeosmida by Yundam Yuil in the 18th century. And he explains very carefully what this is. It's 판조는 이 자심 판조 자심 영지, right? 영지. So the 영지 is shining out, but it's also shining back on itself simultaneously. Yeah, and he says it's like the sun. The sun is shining out light, brightening up the world. But if you trace that light back to the source, you see the sun itself. And same with the mind. So panjo is both a kind of meditation in itself, where you turn the light back on yourself, but it also is this factor of introspection that governs all kinds of meditation. So all meditations really are a kind of panjo. And this idea of Yangji and Panjo ties into Jinul's description of the path of training, this very famous term, dono jamsu. Yeah, so Panjo is sort of the sudden awakening component of the path. You turn the light around, see your original nature, and you know that you are now a Buddha. You see your Buddha nature. And so Jinul says, 수심결에서는 아주 중요한 passage인데, he says, if in one instant, so let's see, where is it here? Yeah, you follow the light back to its source and see the original nature. 일념 회광 견자 본상, right? That's panjo right there. That's what sudden awakening is. 고운 도노. That's what sudden awakening is in Jinul's system. So at that point, you know you're a Buddha. You know that's true. There's no question about it. But just knowing you're a Buddha doesn't mean you can act like a Buddha yet. Yeah, and therefore, this is why Jinul says, after sudden awakening, there still is a process of gradual cultivation, which leads to then, at the conclusion, a second awakening, which he calls the Jongho, the realization awakening or confirming awakening, where not only do you know you're a Buddha, but now you can also act like a Buddha. But this gradual cultivation, because it follows sudden awakening, it's the same cultivation that you would do before awakening, but now, because you know that cultivation is not creating enlightenment, it's simply allowing you to manifest your enlightenment that's already there. It's done in the state, Jinul says, of no thought. So it's the same cultivation as earlier on, but now it's done correctly. And so this I call a kind of a moderate suddenness, a moderate subitism. And Jinul uses the analogy, which comes out of Kyubong Jongmil and from Chingkwang Guksa, that this is like a baby that's born. The birth of a baby, that baby is a fully human being. But the baby has to mature, has to grow up to be able to act like a truly adult human being instead. And of course, this differs from a description of practice of soteriology that is very common today also, this dono donsu, sudden awakening accompanied by simultaneous sudden cultivation, where both are perfected simultaneously. This is the analogy of slicing through a whole spool of thread with a single cut like that. Now, Jino looks at these, both dono donsu and dono jamsu, as well as many other systems of practice, and tries to analyze all these. And he says dono donsu is true. It is correct. Yeah, so dono donsu is correct, but it's only correct from the standpoint of this present lifetime, which means that there are people who are able to have a sudden awakening in which all the practice is simultaneously perfected. But if you look into their past lives, this is because they had already had a sudden awakening of understanding the Heol in a previous lifetime. They've been practicing for some lifetimes, and now in this final lifetime, they seem to finish by dono donsu, by sudden awakening, sudden cultivation. But that's only because they had been doing sudden awakening, gradual cultivation throughout a series of past lifetimes. And so for the vast majority of practitioners, Jino says, he thinks dono chamsu is the appropriate approach to practice. But Jino, late in his life, comes across a new style of practice that is just then beginning in China. And this is this kanwa-san technique. And so at the very end of his major work, the Choyoe-san, at the very end, he appends a section or various sections from Dehe's Sojang, his letters. Yes. And that's the first time in Korean Buddhism when Kanwa-san is ever discussed.
우리 한국 사람이나 한국 스님이 보조 지눌스님의 선사상을 공부하고 널리 선양하는 것도 쉬운 일이 아닌데 외국인으로서 직접 송강사에 오셔가지고 수행자로서 몸소 수행을 하시면서 또 한편으로 보조선을 널리 알리는 그런 작업을 동시에 하셨고 그 수행의 어떤 바탕 위에서 또 미국으로 돌아가셔가지고 대학에서 연구소에서 평생 보조 진울 선사상을 갖다가 선양하는 데 몸을 바치신 분이기 때문에 우리 한국의 어떤 출가자로서 굉장히 그분을 감사하게 생각하고 또 한편으로 소중하게 생각하는 바이죠. 직접 이제 강의를 들었습니다만은 보조 선사상에 대해서 정확하게 꿰뚫고 계시고 그것을 서양에다가 널리 알리고 특히 이제 학문적인 어떤 소양을 가지시고 학문적으로 대학에서 연구소에서 보조 사상을 널리 알린다는 것은 그건 사실 보통 사람이 흉내 내기도 어려운 일인데 그렇게 평생을 보내신 것에 대해서 대단히 감사하기도 하고 또 존경스럽기도 하죠. 남은 인생의 여정에서 보조 사상을 위해서 매진한다고 또 이제 그렇게 말씀하시는 걸 보고 출가자로서 부끄러움도 느끼고 또 어떤 각오도 새롭게 하는 그런 계기가 되었지 않나 이렇게 생각을 합니다.
I don't pretend to be a Kanwa specialist by any means, although I had a long interest in Kanwa-san, that this is a new style of meditation that was just developing in the Chinese mainland, where they use the sayings of previous Sun masters as contemplative topics of meditation. And the point of these questions then, these topics, hwadu, is to raise the sense of doubt, 의심 만들기 위해서, to raise the sense of doubt. And so this is why I sometimes call Kanwa-san questioning meditation, meditation with a question behind it. Yeah, and so so in the way Chino describes this, Kanwa-san begins by questioning, as in the case of Joju Mucha. You would ask, why would Joju say no when the correct answer is you? Wei mu when it should be you. So this creates a question. And so you investigate the meaning. What does he mean by that? And after trying to understand what it means over many, many days, weeks, months, kelches, lifetimes maybe, you finally give up and just sit with the word itself, ku. At that time, you're investigating the phrase, or just you're investigating the word of the gongan itself. 그냥 아무 생각 없이 그냥 화두만 들고 그 깊이 의심으로 들어가야 된다고 생각합니다. And so what this doubt does is to break the tendency we have always to think about, to conceptualize our experience in terms of ourself. Where we are always at the center of everything that happens to us, rather than just being in a state of conditionality, one thing with another. And what Kanwa is doing then is removing the point of view that is my sense of self. And doubt is what drives that process along. And this has, I think, important resonances, important connections with Wonsi Bulyo, which talks about the important stage of what they call nirveda, nibbida, which is disillusionment, this yum here. There's a point in meditation where the person realizes the danger of the world around that person, the impermanence, the suffering that's inherent in that world. And that world becomes so abhorrent that you become disgusted with it. You become disillusioned with it. And what that does, it makes this world is so frightening that you, in fear, turn away from the world. And in turning away from the world, you're turning toward nirvana. And in turning toward nirvana, at that point, we don't know what nirvana is, but we know what nirvana is not. It's not this world, but it's there somewhere. And that's an important switch that has to occur in practice. Okay? And so Kanwa, I think, is trying to do something very similar. It's to create a disgust toward our conceptualization, our sense of self, our ability to understand. And by creating that doubt, it turns us away from ourself and turns us toward enlightenment. So in the way that Dahui talks about this, Dehe Sanza talks about this, there isn't really a process. You simply build the sense of doubt, build and build and build until finally awakening occurs. So it would be typically described as a dono donsu approach. And so as a dono donsu approach, Jino says it's a kyangjonmun, a shortcut approach to practice. Yeah. So this doesn't fit very well with Dono Jomsu, with the approaches that Jino was teaching earlier. And so he's struggling, I think, in his late career with how to reconcile this new approach of Kanwa-san with his preferred path of Dono Jomsu. So late in his life, Actually, just before he dies, he's writing a text called the Kanwa Kyolilon, where he's trying to understand how Kanwa-san can fit with Dono Jomsu. And this is published after his death. It probably has been very heavily edited by his disciple Haeshim Jingakguksa. Right, and so this first approach of Pabyang is what perfects the Chami set. The second approach of Chanjie, comprehensive expression of truth, this is where you perfect investigation of the word instead. And so this second kind of kanwa practice, the chamgus part, is done in the state of no thought. It's kind of like a gradual cultivation component, actually. So we can see how Jinul is very rapidly, very late in his life, shifting from his earlier preferred practices of like Janghe Sangsu, for example, Samadhi and Prajna practice together, shifting toward Kanwa-san, but he hasn't fully integrated it yet into his system. The person who does that is his disciple, Jingakguksa Haeshim. And he's the one who really makes Kanwa-san the very core of Korean Buddhist practice from this point on. And for example, you can see in Haeshim how he actually talks about how some of the other techniques that Jinul uses actually are subsumed into Kanwa-san. Right, and so this is a very Gyeongjulmun where Jiguan and Janghe, Chayun Kijung. So Kanwa-san can actually incorporate all of Buddhist practice, even the most basic kinds of practice, to the most sophisticated kinds of practice. So it's really with Haeshim that Kanwa-san becomes really the core of Korean Buddhist practice. But he's building on a style and on an approach that Jinul has already begun to start late in his life. He dies relatively young, about 55, I think. So he wasn't able to really complete this process. Haeshim is the one who finishes it. And it's thanks to his influence, to Haeshim's influence, that Korean Buddhism really coalesces around Kanwa-san from that point on. And the more ecumenical approach of Jinul somewhat disappears a little bit. When we look at some of the teachers who returned from one nara, from Yuan dynasty in China, such as Naong Haegun that we talked about last night, we can see how this emphasis on Kanwa-san becomes even more pronounced in Korean Buddhism. Right, so they really go to China as Hwadam Sim said last night. They go to China to get Inca from these Chinese teachers, but they have already mastered Kanwa-san in Korea, and so their way of talking about Kanwa-san is a little different from what we see in both China and later on in Japan. And so I think we have in Korea a very distinctive style of Kanwa-san, which you do not find later on in China, and you do not find later on in Japan. It's a very, very unique approach to Kanwa-san, which is still very beholden to Jinul. And so let me give you one example. This is from Taego Powu, but actually a very similar quote was in Naong Haegun quote that we saw last night. This is a quote from him about Hwadu practice. And what I like here is this line, a Hwadu that is bulme, unobscured amidst this quiescence, is called numinous awareness. That's Jinul, right? Right here. This is an ocha, should be mi here, micha. Mi Hwadu, wiji, youngji, right? So this is Jinul's language. And so we can see here also that what he's saying happens in Kanwa-san is that your body and mind and the Hwadu tasangilpyeon fuse into a singularity. Shin sim yo Hwadu tasangilpyeon. Right? So your identity becomes the Hwadu in the course of Kanwa-san practice. And by breaking apart the doubt about the Hwadu, you break apart your sense of self and your body and mind. So what he does here is he fuses Jinul's ontology of mind, Youngji, with Kanwa-san practice in a way that Jinul did not fully accomplish, but now has been fully realized at the end of the Korya dynasty. By using the term Youngji, Youngji는 대해 선사가 아주 비판했습니다. He really excoriated Youngji. This comes from Chongmil. He and Chongmil did not get along at all. 대해 선사 and Chongmil. So he really criticizes Youngji. But the fact that these Korean Kanwa masters use this terminology, this shows how distinct they are from the Dehe Sansa Imjejong line. So Chongmil says that numinous awareness, Youngji, is the gateway to all wonders. But Dehe Sansa says Youngji is the gateway to all calamities instead. 완전히 달라요. And so what we see in this late Korya dynasty period is we have this fusion of this distinctive ontology of mind, Youngji, from Jinul, with this Kanwa practice that Jinul first begins, but is now fully realized at the end of the Korya dynasty. And this is why I think actually that it's no exaggeration to say that of all of the monks, the thinkers in the Korean Buddhist tradition, Jinul is by far the most influential and important. And the book that he writes at the end of his life, Choryo, which is part of the Sajip collection, I think that's the single most influential work ever written by a Korean Buddhist author. I think if you were to ask most scholars of Korean Buddhism who is the most influential, or if you ask most Koreans generally who is the most influential Buddhist, most would say Wonhyo. But in actual fact, from Jinul's period onward, all the way to the modern world, to you all here today, what you're practicing has nothing to do with Wonhyo. It has everything to do with Jinul. So I think what this means is that we have a distinctive style of practicing Korean Buddhism that is different from either Chinese or from Japanese Buddhism. In the West, in America, if anyone thinks of Sun Buddhism, they always think of Japan. But Japanese Buddhism is a very, very late approach to Kanwa-san that is really restored, rebuilt in Japan in the 18th century. It's very new. And the style is completely different, I think, than what the Koreans have today. So your practice has existed for 1,300 years. Their practice has existed for 200 years. So I think you all should be very proud of your tradition. You have a tradition that is distinctive in the world today, a tradition which only you can teach now to the world. Jinul was the monk who founded Songwangsa, where I arrived. So of course, he's a very palpable presence in the monastery. Even his stupa is at the very top of the monastery, looking down over the whole monastic campus. So Jinul was a very real presence at Songwangsa. So part of it was just happenstance, but even more than that, I had always been sort of torn between study and practice. I really wanted to meditate, but I really enjoyed learning about Buddhism too. And I felt that they really go hand in hand. Study is important because it sort of helps to frame practice. It gives you the foundation in, why you're doing what you're doing, how you do it, what some of the pitfalls are, what some of the support systems are for facing the obstacles that come up in practice inevitably. So I think study is extremely important for sort of framing practice and providing a foundation for practice. But it's not enough. You have also to put it into practice. The Sanskrit term for practice is literally it's called pavana. Pavana is Sanskrit for practice. Pavana means bring into being, and that's exactly what I think practice does. It brings into being the teachings of the religion. And so I think study and practice really go hand in hand. In Korea, it's san and kyo. San and kyo, kyamsu. And that's exactly what Jinul teaches, actually. That was his whole approach. So for me, I found him to be a kind of kindred spirit, I really identified with the way he looked at Buddhism, the way he approached Buddhism, and it really resonated with me on many levels, actually. So I was extremely lucky to have landed at Songgwangsa because it fit my own personality and my own interests so well also, which was completely unexpected because I knew nothing about Korean Buddhism before I arrived in Korea. There was not a single book available on Korean Buddhism in English when I was young. So there was no way to learn about Korean Buddhism. It was just by being in Korea that I had the chance to learn. So I was extremely fortunate to come to Songgwangsa when I did, when there was such a vibrant practice tradition, you know, a very dynamic teacher in Kusan-Sunim, some very profoundly experienced meditators who were there at the time with me when I was there, and some great scholars who came through as well, like Popjung-Sunim was in an Namja in back of Songgwangsa. So it was a great time to be at Songgwangsa. So I was extremely lucky, I think. Well, one thing I think about Korea is that there's both a flourishing scholarly tradition and a flourishing meditation tradition. And this is what you don't really see in very many Buddhist communities these days. If you look at Taiwanese Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism right now, for example, there are almost no practitioners there anymore. It's almost primarily scholastic tradition. In Japan, there's a practice tradition, but in very limited form, and often for very limited periods, rather than a lifetime commitment to practice. There are people who, you know, priests will practice for short periods, for a couple of years maybe, but then they move on to playing a kind of pastoral role for their religious community, or they become scholars of Buddhism as well. And so in East Asia, I think Korea is kind of unique now, that it has both a very strong practice tradition, but also a very strong scholarly tradition as well. And both are done simultaneously. So as in the motto that we had here at our event, it was always, San and Kyo Kyomsu, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that really has been the style of Korean Buddhism since at least the time of Jinul, and probably even goes back as far as Wonhyo, actually, that dual practice of study and practice. And that's what really resonated with me when I came here, was I really appreciated that support that study gives to practice, and practice brings kind of your study alive. 불이선회 삶의 수행이다.
Thank you.